Let's go ahead and group these foliage layers together. And we will call the group Foliage. And let's add some more layers of foliage because we really want to fill up this cliffside. And to do that, we can also use an image hose nozzle that is called Foliage Large. It is in the nature category. We'll make a new layer for that and we will call it Foliage 2. And we will use the spray size P angle W color brush. And we'll want to pick a secondary color and pick a tint to use for that. We'll pick a light green like this and give that a try. And the smaller you make your brush, the smaller the trees are going to be. What it's going to do is it's going to spit out a bunch of trees at once. And if you vary your pressure, you'll get smaller trees as well. So I'm going to try to have a good variety of sizes of trees. You want there to be more trees on the top of the cliffs and then fewer as you move towards the bottom. And then towards the bottom, the trees that are closer to the foreground should be bigger in scale. You don't want to make any of them too big because you want them to appear distant, like they're pretty far away. Let's change our color a little bit to something different, and we'll paint in a little bit of variety. You don't want to completely cover everything. You do want there to be some gaps, but you want to add some nice trees here. We can add some darker ones towards the bottom. And then we will select the edges of this foliage that we just put down by doing select layer content. We'll hide the selection. We'll create a new layer and we will call it Foliage to Shadow. We will make this a multiply composite method. We'll use the sponge to paint over it with a dark green color. We'll have to switch to our primary color here. And at the top, we'll use a smaller sponge. And then when we move down, we'll use a bigger sponge. That way our texture stays in perspective. And we can turn down the opacity of both of these layers until we get a more subtle blend. Let's add some more layers for foliage. Call this Foliage 3. Let's try this same Foliage Large brush, but let's use the spray size P angle W without any tinting. That will put in some trees that kind of have their own unique jungle color. We still have that selection active. That's okay, and we can deselect it, and that will let us place more trees here. Lots of trees. You can see I'm not being stingy with how many trees I put in here. And then I'm going to make my brush bigger for these trees near the bottom. And I'll try to concentrate a few up towards the top edge. Let's do a selection of this layer by doing select layer content. We'll create a new layer. We'll call it Foliage 3 Shadow. Make that a multiply composite method. We will hide the selection. And let's use the sponge with a dark green to darken the bottom edges of these trees so that they kind of fade in. Top edges can stay nice and bright. You can even brighten them more if you want to using the square chalk. You could pick a nice bright green and kind of paint over everything. You'll have to go back to the foliage layer, turn on preserve transparency, and you could add some highlights back in. Now, some of these are going to need some trunks, so let's deselect our selection by doing Control D. We'll create a new layer on top of all the foliage that we've put down. And let's call this trunks. This could be trunks and branches. We will turn off preserve transparency. And we'll zoom in so that we can see what we're doing here. Especially these floating treetops, we need to connect some trunks to. We'll do like a dark blue, I think, just to be certain that it matches everything. And we'll use the detail oils brush You'll want to find any trees that are not connected and go ahead and connect those first. And keep the trunks pretty thin because they're very far away. And then anything else that is already pretty well connected, don't worry about that. I'm going to hit tab to make my palettes go away, and then I'm going to here and there just put in some trunks that kind of stick out in between all of these trees. Now, you'll probably want to spend more time than I'm going to spend doing this. I would really take your time here and add a lot of these little branches and twigs. In light areas, you want to add dark twigs and branches and trunks because they'll stand out better. And in areas that are already pretty dark, you want to add some lighter ones. So you could sample a waterfall color, for instance, and in these darker areas, you could put in lighter branches. This really makes this all come together, and it communicates that these are trees now and not some other kind of plant or moss or something. You could just have some dead trees too that don't have anything on them. You want to have some branches that maybe hang over near the waterfall. A little dead tree there that kind of reaches over. Maybe we'll do one more dead tree up here too. Give this some branches that kind of reach out. Okay, that's all I'm going to do for now because you don't want to sit here and watch me paint branches for hours and hours. Now what will help to bring this together a little bit more is if we add a little bit of mist towards the top. So first thing we'll do is we will group all of these foliage layers. We'll do trunks through foliage 2. We'll just call it foliage 2 to kind of tidy things up. And then as the topmost layer, we'll make a layer called mist, and we will use the airbrush for this. We'll sample our sky color here where it's kind of very light towards the top of the waterfall, and we'll use a pretty big airbrush. We will want to set the composite method to screen, and we'll just want to paint a very light gradient, a linear gradient that fades out as it moves down. So at the top here it's pretty thick, and then it starts to really just kind of fade out as you move down, very nice and soft like this. And if you go too heavy with it, you can always turn down the opacity of that layer, because you want it to be just kind of a subtle haze, something like that, and that makes it really look like a jungle. It also makes it look very elevated too, like it's way high up. Now let's do a little bit of work on the foreground to add some trees that are closer to us. Let's add a new layer at the top here, and let's call this branches foreground. And we can pick a pretty dark blue for this. We will use the detail oils brush, and we'll draw in some tree branch kind of twig shapes here. Now you don't want to do too many of these because each of these are going to have their own leaves. We're going to draw in each leaf individually. Make this one thicker. Maybe this is a different kind of plant. And then I'm going to zoom in to these, and then I'm going to make some finer twigs that come off of here. Something like that. Make my brush a little bit smaller so that I can do these twigs here. You don't have to be super accurate because you're going to have leaves covering a lot of this stuff. Now let's add a new layer for leaves foreground. And we will use the leaf knife for this. Now this leaf knife is a little tricky. It takes some practice. It's a very specific amount of pressure and motion and velocity. It's kind of all three together. So I'm going to do a really bright leaf so that you can see what I'm doing here. If you use this brush too slow, it's going to do really weird stuff. It's going to just kind of do this weird wobbly thing, kind of like the mountain knife does. However, if you use it very quickly and you do very short little taps, you get a triangle. So I'm tapping really hard and then easing up on the pressure. So I'm kind of pecking at it like a bird, kind of. That's the trick. You want to do it fast. You want to press down really hard and then let up lightly. And then you'll get all these nice leaf shapes. You can also vary the direction that you go. It's okay if your leaves come out in weird shapes like this because leaves get bent. They're not always perfect and facing towards you. And if you have something you don't like, you can always erase it. So I'm going to just delete those practice leaves, and we can start putting in some leaves that we want to actually keep. I'm going to pick a dark blue-green color like this and do a test. Maybe we'll go a little bit more towards midnight blue, something like that. We want these to look like kind of tropical jungle leaves. So they're going to be really white at the base and then very thin at the tip. And they're going to kind of be longer and hang down in clumps because there's kind of a rainforest scene, and that's just how the leaves there are. So making these leaves that are kind of coming out of the ends of the branches that I drew, and they're hanging down, kind of going a similar direction and fanning out. You can have some that go up, that's okay. You just kind of want to cover the ends of all those branches that you drew. Now we can change the color a little bit, and we'll put in some different leaves for this tree. Maybe this tree has thinner leaves. I changed my brush size. This is really about being spontaneous. You want to have guided spontaneity to where you're intentionally placing these in places that they should go logically, but you're not overthinking all of these leaves individually. You're just putting them in really fast. And that just helps it look more organic and more natural, I think. You want to have some that kind of cover the front of the tree and so on. You can really do lots of different kinds of leaves with this particular brush. I know it seems a little tricky to use at first, but once you just start going at it and just firing in these leaves, you'll see that it works really well. Now we'll turn on Preserve Transparency so that we can add some highlights to these leaves. I'm going to use a green color like this for the leaves that are over here on the left. So you want to try to paint over your leaf with the same stroke that you did, more or less. I think that's too light. It's still too light. You don't want to go too light with it because it's going to be kind of in shadow here in the foreground. You don't have to do all of your leaves, just do some of them. And we'll do this bush on the other side. Maybe this will be kind of more orange colored. Just a few little highlights on it, like the sun's just barely touching it. Do a couple of more yellow spots on these leaves over here on the left. Maybe there's a dead leaf on one of them. We can use a darker color to go over it if we do it too light. And then let's make a selection of this leaves layer by doing Select Layer Content. Turn off Preserve Transparency. Create a new layer. Call it Leaves Foreground Shadow. We'll make it a multiply composite method. And we'll hide the selection. And then we will use the sponge to add some texture over the top of these leaves. So we'll use a dark blue, kind of a smaller diameter for our brush. We do it slightly bigger so we can see it. What you want is a sort of mottled texture over your leaves. Then you can turn down the opacity a little bit till you get a blend that you like. You can see that combined with the lines that are in the palette knife strokes really makes it look like a more detailed leaf now.